Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has died. His office says he passed away following a brief and sudden illness. In a Truth Social post, President Donald Trump called Graham one of the greatest people and senators he has ever known.
On Sunday morning, July 12, 2026, President Donald Trump appeared on television looking like a man who had aged overnight. He moved from one interview to the next, and in every single one, his voice caught on the same detail. He had spoken to Senator Lindsey Graham only hours before Graham died. What started as routine Sunday show bookings turned into something else entirely. A president struggling, in real time, to process the loss of a man he had once called an enemy and later called family. Trump appeared on NBC's Meet the Press that morning, a broadcast Graham himself had been scheduled to join for what would have been his 64th appearance on the program. Instead of the senator, the president sat in the chair, describing a phone call that had taken place the evening before, sometime in the 7 o'clock hour. Graham had just landed after a long flight home from Ukraine, and the two men talked business. Graham was chasing votes for a piece of legislation he cared about, and Trump remembers him sounding like himself, if a little worn down from travel. "He sounded a little tired," Trump said, "but perfect." He added that Graham had earned the right to be tired, because the senator never stopped working. Then Trump said something that landed heavier than anything else he offered that morning. That Graham had felt like a member of his own family, and that losing him was, in his words, very tough. Neither man had any reason to believe that call would be their last conversation. But within hours it was. To understand why that phone call haunted the president so deeply, it helps to look at where Graham had been standing barely a day earlier. Only 24 hours before his death, Graham was in Kiev, on his 10th wartime visit to Ukraine since the full-scale Russian invasion began. He met with President Volodymyr Zelensky, toured a facility producing interceptor drones designed to shoot down Russian attack drones, and told reporters it would be a serious mistake for the United States not to deepen its cooperation with Ukraine's drone industry. Standing in front of destroyed Russian armor, he announced something he had been working toward for well over a year: an agreement with the White House to move forward on a sweeping sanctions package targeting the nations still propping up Russia's war effort, a bill so aggressive that colleagues nicknamed it the Sanctions Bill from Hell. Graham told reporters he had never felt more optimistic that there was finally a real path to ending the war. He believed he had won a major fight. He had no way of knowing he would not live to see the vote. From Kiev, Graham flew back across the Atlantic to Washington, landed, made a handful of calls, including the one to Trump, and went home to his residence on Capitol Hill. That evening, emergency responders were called to his house after reports of chest pain. According to law enforcement and multiple news outlets, his condition deteriorated rapidly. What began as chest pain became a cardiac emergency, and paramedics worked on him before he was taken to George Washington University Hospital. His office confirmed early Sunday morning that Graham had died Saturday night from a brief and sudden illness, asking for prayers and privacy for his family during what they called an incredibly difficult period. He was 71 years old. That statement, brief and carefully worded, left an enormous amount unexplained, and in the vacuum it created, speculation moved fast. Because Graham had spent years as one of the most vocal hawks in Washington on Russia and Iran, because he had just returned from an active war zone, and because threatening rhetoric aimed at American hawks including Graham had surfaced from Iranian-linked media only days earlier, some online voices immediately raised the possibility of foul play. Commentators demanded toxicology tests. Russian and Iranian state media, unsurprisingly, treated the news with open hostility rather than sympathy. But the reporting that followed did not support any of that. Law enforcement sources described the death as consistent with natural causes, and the FBI's involvement, which some seized on as suspicious, was described as routine assistance rather than a criminal investigation. Then, on Sunday afternoon, Graham's office released a follow-up statement citing preliminary findings from the District of Columbia medical examiner. Graham had died of an aortic dissection connected to underlying arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a tear in the body's main artery, a condition that the Mayo Clinic notes is most common in men in their 60s and 70s. It was not poison. It was not an attack. It was his heart, failing suddenly and without warning, the same way it had failed his own father decades earlier. That family history is part of what makes Graham's death land the way it has. He grew up in central South Carolina, in a family that ran a small restaurant and pool hall. When Graham was in his early 20s, his mother died of cancer. Barely more than a year later, his father died of heart disease, leaving Graham responsible for his teenage sister, Darlene. Rather than send her to relatives, Graham took legal custody of her himself, and later formally adopted her so she could receive his military benefits as he served in the Air Force. He spent years afterward describing that period as the one that shaped everything about who he became, a man who had effectively raised his own sibling before he had built a career, a marriage, or children of his own. He never married. When people asked why, over the decades of his public life, Graham tended to deflect with a joke about never finding time to meet the right woman, or about the right woman being too smart to bother with him. Underneath the joke was a man who had already given most of what he had to a family built out of loss, rather than the one he might have built for himself. That history is part of why his sudden death cut across party lines in a way that few deaths in modern Washington do. Graham's relationship with Trump is, on its own, one of the more improbable arcs in recent American politics. During the 2016 campaign, Graham was among Trump's harshest Republican critics, at one point describing him as a race-baiting, xenophobic religious bigot and warning that his nomination would be ruinous for the party. After the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, Graham said on the Senate floor that he was finished, declaring, "Count me out," in a moment that seemed to close the door on the relationship for good. Anyone judging the two men purely by those moments would have assumed they'd remain adversaries indefinitely. Instead, Graham became one of the president's most reliable allies, a frequent golf partner, and by his own description, someone who talked to Trump late into the night more often than almost anyone else in Washington. He leaned into the label of the president's North Star on foreign policy, a phrase that would have been unthinkable from him a few years earlier. In his Truth Social tribute posted early Sunday morning, Trump called Graham one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known and a true American patriot, and asked that flags be lowered to half-staff in his memory. The tributes did not stop with Trump or with Republicans. Senate Majority Leader John Thune called Graham a strong advocate for the United States and a steady ally to nations fighting for their freedom. Democrats who had clashed with Graham for years, including some who fought him bitterly over judicial confirmations and foreign policy votes, offered warm and specific remembrances rather than the usual careful, distant condolences reserved for political opponents. That is a rare thing to earn in Washington, where alliances are conditional and grudges tend to outlast the people who hold them. Graham managed, somehow, to be genuinely mourned by people who had spent years disagreeing with him. Perhaps the most bitter part of the story is what was left unfinished. Graham had spent well over a year building support for the Russia sanctions package, working across party lines and eventually securing what he described in Kiev as a real commitment from the White House to move it forward. He believed, in his final days, that the bill represented a genuine turning point, a tool that could squeeze the Russian economy hard enough to change the calculus of the war. He did not live to see it voted on. In the days after his death, lawmakers from both parties who had worked with him on the legislation suggested that finishing the job would be the most fitting tribute they could offer him. If the bill eventually becomes law, it will do so carrying the fingerprints of a man who is no longer alive to see it pass. There is also the practical matter of what comes next for South Carolina. Graham had just won his Republican primary weeks before his death and was actively campaigning for another term, having held the seat for more than 2 decades. Under South Carolina law, Governor Henry McMaster has the authority to appoint a temporary successor to serve until early January. Graham was only the third person to hold that Senate seat in nearly 70 years, following the legendary tenure of the man who preceded him, and McMaster acknowledged the scale of what had been lost with a line that circulated widely afterward, that South Carolina and the country would not see his likeness again. What makes Trump's Sunday morning appearances so striking, in the end, is not that they hint at some hidden conspiracy, despite what parts of the internet wanted to believe in those first chaotic hours. It is that they show something much simpler and, in some ways, much harder to sit with, a president who spoke to a friend in perfectly ordinary terms about ordinary things, a bill, a trip, a plan to meet the next day, without any sign that anything was wrong. Hours later, that friend was gone. The official record, backed by medical examiners and law enforcement rather than speculation, points to a sudden cardiovascular event, not sabotage. But knowing the cause does not make the timing feel any less brutal. A man who had just returned from the middle of a war zone, still glowing from what he believed was the biggest legislative win of his career, went home, made his calls, and did not wake up the next morning. Sometimes the story genuinely is that simple, and that is often the hardest version of events for people to accept, because simple, sudden loss does not offer anyone a villain to blame, only a phone call that turned out, without warning, to be the last one.